The unredacted deposition lands like a cold weight on the table, not whispered, not teased, but opened. And once opened, it refuses to close. Names appear, not random, not speculative, but clustered, deliberate, connected. Prince Andrew is there, expected, familiar, already scorched into public memory, and beside him sit 8 other royal-linked figures whose anonymity had survived only because silence protected it. That silence fractures in an instant, and the fracture sends a tremor straight through palace walls that have endured wars, abdications, and scandal before, but rarely this kind. Because this is not rumor chasing relevance, it is documentation daring anyone to deny it. Inside Buckingham Palace, the response is not outrage or rebuttal, it is absence. Phones stop ringing, advisors vanish behind doors, messages to Montecito cease mid-sentence. This is how institutions behave when the risk is real. They do not debate narratives, they contain exposure. Prince William, steady to the point of ice, reportedly cuts the final informal channel to his brother, not out of cruelty, but calculation. When a fire spreads underground, you seal tunnels before you shout warnings. Silence becomes the firewall. Across the ocean, the shift is felt immediately. Harry senses it before anyone explains it. The calls that used to come stop. The reassurances evaporate. He begins to pace, not as a rebel prince, but as a man realizing the ground he stands on may never have been solid. For years, he believed he was rescuing a misunderstood woman from a hostile system. He believed the palace rejected her because it was cruel, outdated, jealous. Now a different question claws its way forward, unwelcome and unstoppable. What if the palace hesitated because it saw something he didn't? The deposition reframes everything. 8 names form a web, not confined to one country, one court, or one flag. These are royals who drift between Monaco, the Gulf, Mediterranean ports, men whose power is quiet enough to avoid headlines and deep enough to erase them when needed. They move through yacht decks and private terminals where privacy is law and memory is currency. According to the narrative now circulating, Meghan's missing years intersected with those very corridors, not as an actress chasing auditions, but as a presence appearing in spaces her income could not explain. This is where panic replaces gossip, because once a monarchy understands it may have married into a network rather than a nuisance, the rules change. Damage control becomes threat assessment. The past is no longer embarrassing, it is dangerous. And the most terrifying part is not what the public knows, but what sworn testimony might connect. Harry's return to the UK suddenly looks less like nostalgia and more like instinct. People do not run back to institutions they publicly burned, unless those institutions are the only shelter left when the weather turns lethal. In moments like this, stories stop performing and start collapsing, because paper remembers what mouths forget, and once written, denial becomes a liability instead of protection, everywhere, always.
To understand why those 8 names terrify the palace, you have to understand how power actually circulates when cameras are gone. This is not celebrity culture, it is access culture. Doors open quietly, introductions happen without records, and favors are traded in atmospheres designed to feel accidental. According to accounts tied to the deposition, these royal-linked figures shared overlapping routes, the same yachts, the same private clubs, the same cities that function like neutral zones where identities blur and questions are discouraged. Observers at the time did not accuse, they noticed. They noticed the frequency of international travel, the level of accommodation, the jewelry, the proximity to people whose circles were closed by design. None of it proved anything, but none of it aligned neatly with the life of a mid-level television actress either. At the center of those movements sits a single recurring figure, Marcus, described by insiders not as a friend, but as a facilitator. He knew where people sat, who spoke to whom, which conversations were encouraged, and which were redirected. Soho House, often dismissed as a trendy club, appears in these accounts as infrastructure, a soft landing strip where aspirational figures were filtered and positioned. Tables were not random, invitations were not casual. The environment created plausible deniability while manufacturing access. This is how networks grow without signatures. The deposition allegedly maps overlaps between this world and the 8 royal-linked names now causing alarm. Not accusations, but intersections. Same weeks, same locations, same events. In legal terms, intersection is where questions begin. It is where investigators ask who introduced whom, who paid, who arranged travel, and why certain names recur in proximity logs. For a palace built on lineage and legitimacy, even the suggestion of unmanaged proximity is intolerable. This is why the response is containment, not commentary. Royals have survived scandal by absorbing it, burying it beneath ritual and time, but absorption only works when facts remain foggy. Depositions remove fog. They replace it with dates, documents, and sworn statements that do not bend for reputation. Harry now finds himself trapped between 2 systems. One thrives on exposure and storytelling. The other survives on silence and control. The tragedy is that he chose the first while depending, in crisis, on the second. As whispers harden into inquiries, the past stops being a rumor and starts behaving like a ledger. And ledgers do not care about love stories. They care about consistency, funding, access, and who was present when presence mattered. That is the fear rippling through palace corridors tonight, because once questions start forming around networks instead of narratives, endings are negotiated.
As the palace tightens its perimeter, another pressure point emerges that explains the urgency: succession. Royal systems can tolerate embarrassment, even scandal, but they cannot tolerate ambiguity around lineage. That is why procedures exist. Witnesses sign, doctors confirm, and announcements follow ritual. When those steps are absent or altered, institutions do not shrug, they audit. According to accounts surrounding the deposition, this audit is already underway, quiet and clinical, focused on records rather than reactions. For years, gaps were explained as privacy. Privacy can coexist with protocol, but protocol leaves traces. Birth notices, hospital confirmations, contemporaneous documentation, timelines that align without improvisation. Investigators do not need drama, they need coherence. Where coherence breaks, questions form. Those questions are not accusations, but they demand answers that cannot be supplied by sentiment or press releases. This is why silence from official channels is not indifference, it is process. Inside Montecito, the atmosphere reportedly changed as advisors recalculated risk. The children, once shields against criticism, became focal points of verification. That shift is brutal. It transforms a public narrative into a compliance exercise. Cooperate and stabilize, resist and escalate. Neither option favors spectacle. Both favor containment, which is why movement matters, jurisdiction matters, timing matters. A quiet return to Britain is not nostalgia, it is legal geography. For Harry, this moment exposes a fracture he tried to deny. He believed transparency could outpace scrutiny, that storytelling could outrun structure. Royal systems are the opposite. They move slowly, document everything, and outlast headlines. The extraction scenario discussed by commentators is not cinematic, it is administrative. Safe residences, limited access, council briefings, and time. Time to let procedures work while noise exhausts itself elsewhere. The most destabilizing element is not any single name on the list, it is the pattern those names suggest. Networks create obligations, and obligations create leverage. Leverage is invisible until it is exercised. Depositions convert leverage into language, and language into risk. Once that conversion begins, reputations become variables, not assets. What happens next depends on alignment. If facts reconcile cleanly, the institution absorbs the shock and moves forward. If they do not, titles adjust, narratives retire, and history edits itself without apology. Monarchies have done this before. The difference now is speed. Digital memory never forgets, and sworn testimony travels faster than ceremony. The lesson unfolding is older than any headline. Power protects itself not with outrage, but with order. When order activates, personal stories yield to procedure. That is the moment when those closest to the center feel the ground shift. Not because the truth is loud, but because it is methodical. This shift reframes every prior debate, draining emotion and elevating evidence. It rewards patience, punishes improvisation, and favors institutions built for endurance. As processes advance, outcomes narrow. There are fewer exits, fewer explanations, and less room for performance. What remains is paperwork, testimony, and time, the three forces that quietly decide legacies long after applause fades. History records results, not intentions, when systems finally close their books.
As the machinery turns, attention shifts to the list itself, not for spectacle, but for corroboration. 8 names do not function as accusations, they function as coordinates. Investigators read them as intersections, where timelines can be compared, travel logs aligned, invitations cross-checked, and communications reconstructed. This is where myths dissolve. Networks leave patterns. Patterns leave trails. Trails are patient. They do not require confession to exist. Within the palace, response teams are said to be separating noise from signal. Old photographs are not proof. Old friendships are not guilt. What matters is contemporaneity. Who was present where and when? Who introduced whom? Which flights overlapped? Which events were invitation only? The work is slow because precision is the shield. Move too fast and mistakes multiply. Move deliberately and uncertainty shrinks. This deliberation reframes public missteps once dismissed as clumsy. Why certain appearances were avoided, why announcements deviated from tradition, why documentation felt minimal rather than excessive. In isolation, these choices were shrugged off. In aggregate, they form a logic that begs review. Institutions are allergic to unexplained deviations because deviations invite challenge. Challenge invites inquiry. Inquiry demands closure. Meanwhile, the economic ecosystem around the story recalibrates. Brands are conservative animals. They sense volatility before it is named. When risk increases, interest evaporates quietly. Meetings pause, options expire, contracts wait. This is not punishment, it is self-preservation. No one wants proximity to unresolved questions, especially when sworn testimony looms. Silence spreads not because of loyalty, but because of calculus. For Harry, the recalibration is personal. He faces the inversion of his chosen narrative. He once believed distance from the institution would grant autonomy. He now confronts the reality that institutions are also shelter when storms escalate beyond persuasion. Family becomes jurisdiction. Home becomes protection. The return is not defeat, it is recognition of scale. Individual will cannot outpace systems designed to endure. As the process advances, contingency planning becomes visible in its absence. No counteroffensive interviews, no surprise disclosures, no grandstanding. These are signs of counsel prevailing over impulse. The most effective strategy in moments like this is to do less, not more. Every word spoken prematurely becomes a variable to reconcile later. Every promise becomes an obligation. Restraint narrows exposure. Public fascination will spike and fade. That is predictable. What persists is the record. Records do not care about sentiment. They care about consistency. If consistency holds, the storm passes. If it fractures,
outcomes harden. Titles adjust, roles change. The story compresses into a footnote that explains a transition rather than a saga that defines an era. The quiet truth is that palaces do not panic because of headlines. They respond to documents. When documents align, the future is boring, and boring is victory. When they do not, the institution moves without drama, because drama amplifies loss. In either case, the path forward is narrower than it was yesterday. Choices that once felt flexible become fixed. What remains is compliance, clarity, and closure. As clocks tick, the question everyone asks privately is not who said what, but whether the story can be reconciled with the archive. If it can, history smooths the edges and proceeds. If it cannot, history edits. Editing is not cruelty, it is maintenance, and maintenance is how institutions survive long after personalities fade from view.
By the final stretch, the narrative narrows to resolution, because all prolonged uncertainty eventually demands an endpoint. Not a spectacle, not a confession, but an administrative conclusion. That is how enduring systems protect themselves. They reduce chaos into paperwork, emotion into procedure, and controversy into archived decisions stamped with dates. The public rarely witnesses this phase, yet it is the only phase that truly matters. Behind closed doors, evaluators compare statements against immutable data. Logs do not emote, they do not reinterpret themselves. They either match or they do not. When inconsistencies surface, they are flagged without commentary. No anger, no vindication, just margins marked in red. That is how outcomes are shaped, line by line, until a verdict becomes inevitable, without ever being announced aloud. For the monarchy, legitimacy is oxygen. It cannot be rationed or improvised. Every generation inherits the burden of proving continuity, not through charisma, but through compliance with rules older than the individuals enforcing them. This is why sentiment cannot override protocol. This is why lineage, documentation, and verification matter more than popularity or grievance. When those pillars are questioned, sentiment becomes irrelevant. Across the Atlantic, distance offers no insulation from consequence. Modern systems are interoperable. Jurisdictions speak. Records travel. Silence in one country does not erase filings in another. This is the reality now settling in, heavy and unavoidable. The belief that reinvention alone could outpace scrutiny begins to dissolve under the weight of interconnected oversight. The emotional arc concludes quietly. There is no dramatic exile, no cinematic confrontation. Instead, there is attrition. Access narrows, options shrink, invitations stop arriving, influence cools. This is not revenge, it is entropy. When credibility drains, ecosystems adjust automatically. The spotlight moves because it always moves towards stability, not spectacle. Harry's role stabilizes as well, not as a rebel or a victim, but as a variable resolved. Systems prefer clarity to loyalty. Once clarity is restored, relationships can be redefined without urgency. The tension that once fueled headlines dissipates, replaced by routine. Routine is the goal. Routine is peace. What remains of the story is no longer scandal, but caution, a case study whispered among advisors and institutions about proximity, vetting, and the cost of haste. It will not be taught publicly, but it will be remembered privately. That is how powerful lessons persist, unspoken yet influential. In the end, history does not funder, it files, it footnotes. It adjusts titles, removes ambiguity, and moves forward without apology. Personal narratives fade, but institutional memory does not. The archive closes, the record stands, and the future resumes its quiet march. And somewhere between the silence and the signatures, the truth finds its place, not as a triumph or a tragedy, but as a conclusion, solid, final, and unmoved by the noise that once surrounded it.